All right, I think you should be good to go.
All right, well, thanks everyone for being here. Our last session, we appreciate your patience. And we've got three excellent speakers here for this session. It's applying the public records law to GIS. I want to make a note if you're wanting to get AICP credit for this session, and it's going to have a little bit of a different name for the AICP credit. It's going to talk, and I don't remember the exact name, is something about public records law and economic development. The planners wanted to put that economic development piece in the name. That was kind of a last minute change, and so we're doing that. And of course, that's part of Blake's topic, so but it's relevant. Our first speaker is Jonathan Jones, and are you PhD? Oh, okay, but you're a professor, right, at Elon. So you're a professor at Elon, specializes in public records and public information. I'll just read his bio. Jonathan is a government transparency advocate and has served as the director of the North Carolina Open Government Coalition and its affiliated Sunshine Center at Elon University since August of 2013. And Jonathan's worked as a newspaper reporter in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina for 6 years, prior to enrolling at UNC Chapel Hill in a joint degree program in law and journalism, and which I think gives him a very good perspective on both sides of working within the public sector as well as journalism. So thank you for being here, and turn it over to you.
Thank you all for having me today. So the first thing I want to do is introduce you to the North Carolina Open Government Coalition. North Carolina Open Government Coalition is a broad-based group of organizations. It includes the North Carolina Library Association. We have, why did this thing work? Did it go out on me? Well, I can do it this way.
Yeah, let me slide it. Sorry about that. You better reach out of that.
Yeah. That's still not advancing. What's wrong? There we go. Let me see. All right. So we have the Library Association. We have local governments, including the town of Cary, the town of Kannapolis. We have the League of Women Voters, public policy groups like that. We also have educational institutions like Elon University and the North Carolina Scholastic Media Association. And we have a lot of media members. That makes up a significant portion of our coalition. You'll see several of the leading news outlets across the state. And lastly, we have our lawyers. We have lawyers from several of the leading law firms across the state that do open government work. So why do I tell you all that? Well, first, most of the folks I find aren't familiar with that the coalition exists. And I want you to see that we are a broad-based group. We're nonpartisan. We exist to advocate for government transparency. Now, I never miss an opportunity to promote our app. So I always start off my presentation with that, and then I'll get into the meat of it. If you are interested in government transparency in North Carolina, we have an application, a mobile app, called the North Carolina Sunshine app that you can find in your app stores. This is a useful tool for both people who deal with public records as government workers, as well as for people who are seeking information from the government. There's two different interfaces there, depending on which role you're playing, and it'll help you answer questions, basic questions about the open government law. All right. So now, as far as my presentation goes, it's going to be in two parts here. The first is a brief overview of the North Carolina Public Records Law, and then the second part will be looking at how that might apply to the work that you all do with GIS. All right. The North Carolina Public Records Law, what is it? Well, the North Carolina Public Records Law says that a public record shall mean all documents, papers, letters, maps, books, photographs, films, sound recordings, magnetic or other tapes, electronic data processing records, artifacts, or other documentary material, regardless of physical form or characteristics, made or received pursuant to law or ordinance in connection with the transaction of public business by any agency of North Carolina government or its subdivisions, That's a mouthful. I think I just broke about every rule of presenting by putting up way too much text on the screen and reading it to you. Why do I do that? Well, I want y'all to see that the North Carolina Public Records Law is incredibly broad. It covers all government documents, regardless of form. Okay? Unless there's a specific exemption, all government documents are considered public records in the state of North Carolina. The second part of the Public Records Law is this wonderful statement that says the public records and public information compiled by the agencies of North Carolina government are the property of the people. Therefore, it is the policy of the state that people may obtain copies of their public records. This is a strong statement, one of the strongest you'll find in the country, about the relationship between government records and the citizens. It defines a public record in the state as the property of the citizenry, and that they should have access to it when they seek access. Okay? Now, a minute ago I mentioned that unless there is an exemption, all documents are the property of the people. There are a lot of exemptions. At last count, there were more than 100 in North Carolina. Okay? They all tend to center around some specific topic areas, though. We have confidential communications by attorneys to public agencies. So for those of you who work with, say, a planning board or a city council, the attorney who represents that planning board or that city council is allowed to have confidential communication with the board in order for them to make decisions based on the advice of their lawyer. We have certain tax information. Now, this does not extend to property taxes. I know many of you probably have dealt with property tax records. This does not extend to property tax records, but income tax records, other tax records that indicate how much a person makes will be exempt from the Public Records Law. Probably the largest group of exemptions have to do with criminal investigations. Law enforcement in North Carolina get a very broad exemption, much broader than we see in other states. There are some limits on those law enforcement exemptions, though. They do have to, law enforcement does have to disclose certain information, things like the time, date, and location of incidents. They have to provide the name, age, address, employment, and charges of those who are arrested. They have to provide the circumstances surrounding an arrest, and they have to provide copies of 911 calls and emergency communications. Lastly, they also have to provide the victim's identity unless the victim would be in danger by releasing that information. That kind of information is what's on your standard police report. And there are some folks out there, we're going to look at a crime mapper in a little bit. I'm sure you all are familiar with those. Police reports often come up with those crime mappers. Certain parts of the police report are going to satisfy the police's responsibility to release those specific pieces of information. North Carolina law exempts autopsy photographs. That makes some sense, I suppose. That came about after the death of Dale Earnhardt, and some folks down in Florida were seeking copies of his autopsy photos, and states all across the country, including North Carolina, then exempted them. We have Social Security numbers. This is one that I think y'all ought to be aware of. Social Security numbers in North Carolina are not public records. If they exist on a public record, it's incumbent on the government agency to redact the Social Security number before it is disclosed through a public records request. And now, when I worked in the district attorney's office in Durham, I did that for a couple of years before joining the coalition. It was common for me to see all sorts of reports that could be considered public records under the North Carolina Public Records Law, where no one had redacted those Social Security numbers. But so I know that doesn't always happen the way it should. It's something to be aware of. Economic development incentives. These are exempt from the Public Records Law until a government agency has decided that they're actually going to award the incentives and the business accepts that award. So these are some of the broad examples of exemptions that are to the public records law. Now, one more kind of big area that comes up quite frequently, y'all might have seen something about this in the press in the last year, is personnel records. Personnel records are specifically exempted from the public records law, but there's some limitations. There's certain information that the government has to provide, including the name, age, and date of hire of all government employees. They have to provide the current position and salary of government employees. They have to provide the date of the most recent promotion, demotion, transfer, suspension, separation, or other change, and they have to provide the reasons for any promotion. I say you might have heard about this in the papers lately. This has been at the heart of one of the many lawsuits against my alma mater, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, over disclosure of folks who were disciplined in the wake of the academic and athletic scandal. And the university has refused until recently to identify the people who were fired by the university as a result of that scandal. Okay. When someone is dismissed, they have to provide the date of a dismissal, suspension, or demotion for disciplinary reasons. And if someone is dismissed from a government agency in the state, the government agency has to provide a letter that is addressed to the person who's been fired that provides the reasons for that dismissal. Okay? So that's the personnel law is one of the largest areas that we run into with the exemptions to the open government law. Now, we have some common issues that come up, and I'll cover these briefly, and then we'll get into how some of the public records law might affect the work that you all do with databases. First, the government cannot charge fees for examination of public records. Okay? The North Carolina public records law is very explicit that the only fees that can be charged are for copies and not for an examination. So if you're holding on to a database and I want to come look at it, you need to make that available to me in some way to come look at it at your place. That's most often done with an online portal of some kind where folks can just access it from home. If you're not going to put it online, then there needs to be a way for citizens who want to come in and look at the database to be able to do that. Governments can charge the actual cost for copying. That doesn't include staff time. Okay? So it has to be limited to the cost for the materials to copy the paper. There's an exception to that does come up with these large data requests, and that is the special service charge for extensive requests. Okay? This has been a bone of contention in recent months as the current state administration has been trying to charge the special service charge for any requests that take, initially they were trying to do it for any request that took more than 30 minutes of staff time. Now the state agencies have changed that to any requests that take more than 4 hours of staff time. But we are seeing the use of these special service charges increase across the state in both state and local governments. And like I said, these most typically come up in requests for a large amount of data where it takes a significant amount of time to process it, particularly coming up in emails requests. All right, so how does this apply to geographical information systems? Well, the North Carolina Public Records Law directly addresses geographical information systems in the last clause. It creates a qualified exception for GIS. That qualified exception makes clear that GIS databases are going to be public records. Okay? There's no doubt that these databases are public records. It also makes clear that access to the citizenry must be provided, either through a terminal at the government agency or through some other means. And I put online portal up there because that seems to be the most likely and most common way to create access in the state from what I have seen. The exception, we call it an exception because this is one of two areas where a request must be in writing. Okay? If I want to go down to the Raleigh City Hall and ask for a copy of the city budget, I can walk in there and I can verbally ask for a copy of the city budget. That request should be honored. When it comes to GIS systems, the request must be in writing. And that makes sense, as these systems are a little bit more complicated than a physical copy of the city budget. The other exception here is that this is the one area where the government is allowed to put restrictions on how the data is to be used. When you are fulfilling a GIS public records request, you can put a limitation on that use by having the person who's requesting the information agree through a simple contract that they will not sell the data or they will not otherwise use it for trade or commercial purposes. Okay? So that does put a limitation on, that can put a limitation. Doesn't mean you have to, but if you have a database that you're concerned about how the person requesting it might want to use it, you can put that kind of a restriction on it. Doesn't mean you can't withhold the document, the database, but it means that you can limit how it's used. Now, commercial use or trade purposes has three exceptions. One of those is for the news. So if the request is coming from the news media, then you're not going to be able to put that kind of limitation on. The other two are both related to how data is used by real estate groups. There's an exception for the multiple listing service, and there's a corollary exception for real estate trade associations so that they can build their databases that show which properties are for sale. A little quirk of this portion of the public records law is that it is limited to cities and counties. So that means a state agency is not going to be able to charge or put that limitation on how its GIS data is used the same way that a city or county would be. Why the General Assembly did that, I'm not sure. This law was first enacted 20 years ago, or this portion of the law was first enacted 20 years ago. Since it's been put in place, we've never had it come up as an issue. Never had a court case that arose out of failure to provide GIS information or having one of these contracts become an issue. The other section of the public records law that specifically would apply to electronic or to GIS would be the electronic database section. Okay? This was done at the same time as the GIS exception that we just went through. This is the other area of the law where the government can require that a request be made in writing. Okay? These are the only two public records requests that can be required to be made in writing. The public records law defines a database as a structured collection of data or documents residing in a database management program or spreadsheet software. Now, I'm not a tech guy. I didn't say that at the beginning. I usually do. So y'all talk a different language than I understand. But as I understand that definition, I think that is likely to cover a lot of GIS systems. So I think both of these prongs will apply to GIS data. Now, one of the things that the database section of the law does is it requires every government agency to maintain an index of all databases that they have created. Okay? And that index is specifically a public record, and the index must describe the format of the database, how often the database is updated, the list of fields to which access is restricted. So let's say one of the fields in our database is a Social Security number, and the Social Security numbers are, as I mentioned before, are specifically exempted from the public records law. Then that field would have to be noted as being one that is restricted. A description of the form for reproduction. So how are we going to make a copy of this database available? That has to be included in the index. And lastly, there has to be a schedule of fees for copies of each form. Okay, so how much is it going to cost to create this copy of this database? Unlike the GIS database section of the law, this one has come up once where we've had a dispute. That is a court case that is was just argued earlier this week on Tuesday. It was supposed to be last week, but because of the weather, it got moved to Tuesday of this week, where LexisNexis sued for access to the Administrative Office of the Courts database. Anybody here work at Administrative Office of the Courts? I don't know what GIS data they might have. If you have ever dealt with AOC's, you may have, if you've ever dealt with AOC, you may have experienced their automated infraction and crime system, ACIS, ACIS, AICS. ACIS is a 1980s era database that contains criminal records as well as traffic infractions from every county across the state. And the question in that court case is who owns the database. ACIS is maintained by the Administrative Office of the Courts, but each of the clerks of court are the ones who are responsible for entering information into it. And so this is the first case to involve the electronic databases portion of the public records law, 20 years after it was passed. ACIS, the Administrative Office of the Courts claims that the database is owned by each individual clerk of court. They each own their little section of the database. And the LexisNexis is claiming that AOC itself owns the database. So this is an important court case that will help us understand how the database portion of the law is to be interpreted, and we should expect a judgment from the Supreme Court in about 3 months. Now, how do we use this data? Well, I guess I probably don't need to tell you all. You all understand how mapping public records works better than I do. But I'll show you a couple of quick examples since I don't have a whole lot of time left. First, we have what I would call the good. This is a crime mapper. I'm sure some of y'all have dealt with crime mappers. That's my house. Let's see. Right there, a little dot there. I picked it because I live in Durham. I picked it because I knew I'd get some of these heat maps over here where they have taken we've got mapped out specific crimes, ones that I chose. So the little feet are death investigations. We've got these are robberies in a house, a burglary of a house. This is a theft of a motor vehicle, and that's DWIs. I'm interested in DWIs because I spent a year prosecuting DWIs in Durham, and there's this intersection near my house where they catch a lot of people, which makes me nervous to drive at night. This is a really valuable tool. These kinds of tools are really valuable for the public, for someone like me who doesn't work in government, to be able to be aware of what's happening in my neighborhood. Okay? This is a product called Raids Online that Durham contracts with. I'm sure y'all are probably familiar with groups like that. How can it go wrong? Well, I always advocate for access to information, but how we use that information doesn't always work out well. This is what I would call the bad. This is a map of Westchester County, New York. Every dot on the map represents a gun permit. The News Journal newspaper in Westchester, New York, went down to county offices, got a copy of the database of gun permits in the county. Then they created a map pinpointing the location of every person, every home in the county where a person had a gun permit. So that's bad. I don't have a problem with the public knowing that whether or not their neighbor has a gun, but this created a huge uproar in New York as well as across the country. Almost every state in the country that has gun permits as public records, they were quickly exempted from the public records law. Prior to the News Journal doing this ill-thought-out map, the gun permits in North Carolina were public records. Gun permits in North Carolina are no longer public records. So there can be a consequence to using these public records and mapping them out in a way that doesn't serve the public's good. One last thing to note, there is, since when we talk about GIS, we're obviously talking about keying data to a specific location. The North Carolina has an address confidentiality program that is maintained by and managed by the Attorney General's office. If you work in government and a citizen comes to your agency and presents documentation that they are part of this address confidentiality program, it's incumbent upon you to remove not to remove their information from your database, but to make sure that you change their address in the database. This program is specific for domestic violence victims, and what it does is it provides them an alternative address that's managed by the Attorney General's office to protect their actual address from appearing in most public records. I say most public records because it does not apply to property tax records. So if you're mapping out, property parcels that identify who the owner of the parcel is, this is not something to be concerned about. And it's important to remember that it's incumbent on the participants in the program to come to you and let you know that they are a part of this program. I have a few resources up here that for y'all to look at as far as open government. I'll provide a copy of this to the organizers. There's the North Carolina Open Government website, ncopengov.org. You can reach me there at 336-278-5506 or by email at ncopengov@elon.edu. The North Carolina Department of Justice has an excellent guide to open government and public records that was developed with the North Carolina Press Association. And then the State Archives has a blog called the GS 132 Files, which is an excellent place to get updates about issues in open government. And the School of Government also has a blog called Codes Canons, where they often talk about open government issues. I tend to disagree with the School of Government on interpretation of the law, but that's between me and them. And lastly, we've got the North Carolina Media Law Handbook and a couple of books about open meetings in the state. So I appreciate y'all having me, and I will hand it over to the next person.